In this video, we are going to be studying intertidal communities, which was one of my favorite topics to talk about because most people everywhere, even if they don't have a lot of experience with the beach, they probably have seen a tide pool, which is just awesome. So, intertidal communities are very well adapted communities that have to survive the highest high tide of the year and then having the lowest low tide of the year. That makes for a very stressful environment, and it's organisms that have to be able to survive being desiccated, like completely dried out, searing heat, being underwater, being out of the water, being salty, being in the air, like all these different things. They have to be able to survive. So they are very diverse and very well studied. Here's a cool video by Underwater Show, the Intertidal, that I recommend watching. So the first set of shores that we're going to talk about are the rocky shores, and that's actually 75% of shoreline. So they tend to be more dense and diverse than other spaces. And mainly that happens because there's rocks available for the organisms to hold onto. So in California, you see these from Alaska all the way down to California, and on the east coast of the United States from Cape Cod and on northward. And part of that has to do with our margins that we have there. In California, we actually have an active continental margin. This will make our area really full of rocks because we have different plate tectonics that are going on here, that where two plates are really like colliding or like rubbing against each other, and it makes it so that it's very earthquake prone. You have a lot of volcanoes, and we look different from this passive continental margin that is on the east coast, which is dominated by sand and sediment, and you don't have as much volcanic activity, earthquake activity right there on the coastline. So there's various adaptations on rocky shores to be able to live on these rocky shores, because what lives there has to go from being alternating between being under the water, where they have to get air one way while they're underwater, and then above the water they can get air a totally different way. There's going to be saltwater fluctuations. Additionally, a major concern that they have is wave shock. Wave shock is how a wave kind of crashes or bangs on the side of the rocky surface, and you've seen, I'm sure, different people get knocked over by waves. They are very strong, and so these tiny critters have to have a way to survive. So the ways that they do survive both overheating and drying out desiccation is they tend to have a larger body. You might look at these shells and go, but they don't really have that large of a body. But actually, compared to the critter inside, this actually is a pretty big shell. They also will have a opening where they keep water inside, and inside their shell, and they'll release it as needed through the day for evaporation. They also tend to hang out in groups because it is cooler that way, and they will even close this trap door to keep in water, called the operculum. You'll see some, not all, shells will be, sometimes the ones in sunnier places will be light colored so they don't get quite as hot as a darker shell. So to avoid being shocked by the waves, a lot of organisms have a compressed or flat body. Some of them will actually cement themselves or have different enlarged feet to really hold themselves on to the rocks, like these chitin that you see there. And some, like this mussel that you have there, will actually throw out these little things called byssal threads to kind of grasp on and hold on during the wave shock. And then, of course, this stipe of algae at the bottom is modified into these filament like shapes called the holdfast that will hold fast to the bottom, because it doesn't have a traditional root system, so it has the holdfast at the bottom to hold on and to resist the wave shock. So here's different things that can live in different zones. Of course, these organisms in the low tide zone rarely have to be above the water, just on the lowest low tides of the year, but they do need to be able to survive that. And then you go up higher and higher. And at the highest areas, like in this splash zone here, this is an area where it's barely getting wet at all. So you need creatures that are going to be very strong and can, avoid being fully desiccated and dried out. So a few of these that we're going to talk about are the Superlitoral Fringe zone. This is splash zone. It only has a little bit of water in at the highest high tides. The Midlatural zone, which is half covered and half not, depending on the tides. And the Infraratorial, which is the subtidal, meaning below subtidal, below the tides areas. So in the Superlitoral Fringe, this is going to have very little moisture. Not very many organisms will live there. You will find some lichens. Remember that lichens are very good at surviving, and sometimes you can find them hiking in the desert or the mountains where it's very dried out. And remember that a lichen is actually not just one creature, it's kind of a combination of two creatures. On the outside, it is a fungus, which it has like a clear body, and it gives protection to the inside algae that grows inside of it. And the algae, to repay the favor of living inside the fungus, will actually photosynthesize and give the fungus some food. So it's a mutualistic relationship, and it can survive pretty harsh conditions higher up out of the water. And you might have something like the rough periwinkle, which can create mucus to avoid drying out, but is also able to move as needed. In the midlitoral zone, you'll have some creatures that alternate between wet and dry during the day. And one of them in Southern California that's typically just walked all over is you'll walk across rocks, and these barnacles are just razor sharp. And if you look closely at them, there's different species of barnacles, but they usually have this trapdoor like opening, this slit right here. And interestingly, that trapdoor is capable of opening underneath the water when it's covered, and it lets out this filamentous piece that will go and gather food for it in the water. They're densely populated because it's easier for breeding, protection, helping each other, and they are permanently attached there in many cases. Other organisms that are there are oysters and mussels, limpets, periwinkles, which again, we said they're a shelled snail that can live higher. There's also bivalves that will feed during the high tide, oysters, mussels that will trap water in their shells. There's limpets and chitons that graze, and a lot of like the periwinkles and other organisms, they will actually bury themselves for safety. I want to show you this organism. This is actually an urchin. These urchins, there are rock boring urchins that will actually drill a hole down into the rock. I've seen them all over Hawaii drilling holes down into the coral, and they will make this little hidey hole for protection and to be a good place to feed. So also in the midlitoral zone, you'll find algae. This is super important in the Southern California area, and the algae will create this important ecosystem for different organisms to have babies, to come and hunt, to learn, like as they are first born, how to hunt and to grow. And it's a vital ecosystem. In order to stay buoyant, the algae will actually have an air bladder to help it stay buoyant and a holdfast to hold on during the waves. But some of it is broken off and comes and washes onto our beaches, specifically when it gets above about 70 degrees in Southern California in the water. This will break off and come onto our beaches. But even in death, it is actually very helpful to other organisms because they will stay hydrated throughout the day underneath that big raft of kelp and algae that is there on the beach. Okay, so in the infralitoral zone, this area is submerged all the time, except occasionally in some tides like spring tides, where it's just briefly out of the water. So you'll see different seaweeds, mollusks, sea stars, brittle stars, kelp, and that kind of thing. Okay, so tropical rocky shores, we've been talking about temperate rocky shores, but this is tropical rocky shores. And this is more what you would see in areas near the equator. There is less temperature variation and things are steady. The conditions are steady throughout the year. There is 30% more sun than in temperate areas. And they will actually have a lot more stress because of their high temperatures that they have there. So in the tropical areas, you'll find there's in the superlitoral, that means above water, it's above the water zone. The above water zone is broken into three areas, and you can kind of see them in this picture: the white zone, the gray zone, and the black zone. And not a big shocker, but a lot of the organisms like periwinkles will move in between all three of these to whatever suits them and works best for the moment. So you'll see a lot of crossover between these zones, but they are different colors because they are basically hit by the water in different amounts and have different things growing on them. In the midlatural fringe, that is a little bit below that, a little bit below, and so they will have some wet areas. You'll have the yellow and the pink zones. The yellow zone will often have yellow and brown algae, barnacles, limpets, chitons, rock snails, all of that. And in the pink zone, you'll get some really cool things like irregular worm snails, which is right here. It's so cool looking. You'll get anemones and limpets, and it's just a really fun place to go and tide pool. In the infraratorial fringe, this is the surf zone. This is where rocks can be covered with algae, and it makes it really slippery. So sometimes you'll go from where you're tide pooling just fine, and you'll go deeper, and you'll hit an area that it is super slippery. You're probably in the infraratorial zone. There's urchins, anemones, sponges, sea cucumbers, keyhole limpets, and here's a really cool video by Brave Wilderness, creepy tide pool creatures, that goes over a lot of what lives in these tide pools. In the tropical rocky shores, the subtidal, so this is mostly under the water, it's actually relatively barren, and that's kind of a shocker. You would think there would be a ton of stuff here. But because there is so much herbivory, meaning organisms that are eating other organisms, like different fish that will eat, like the algae and other critters, there's not much growing here, because if you grow here, you're probably going to get eaten. So small red algae dominates here, but this is very typical of what you will see in Hawaii in the subtidal zone. It's just very difficult to live there. So if you're comparing the tidal zones of both temperate and tropical rocky intertidal systems, you will see, and this is one that is very tropical. This is, I don't know for sure that this picture came from Hawaii, but this is typical of what you would see in Hawaii. This is typical of what you would see in the temperate and in Southern California. There's higher stress and there's more predation in the tropics. That means that there's also less organisms that can't move. Like any organism that lives here in the Hawaii one, they have to be able to move to get away from predators. In Southern California, because this is in the temperate areas, because there's not as much predation, it allows you to be sessile. You can stay in one place and you can develop a larger body. So you'll see more macroorganisms there, including in Southern California, macroalgae. Some very big kelp algae will be there. So tide pools, again, they have to, as water, so think about the tide pools as like water came up and then it settled in these little rocks, and then the tides have gone out. And now there's a little puddle pool that it's very small, and it's got all these critters in it throughout the day. Well, let's think about what it has to go to. First of all, it has to avoid the humans, which it can't move. So that's just good luck if it gets, visitors or not. But then it also will lose oxygen during the day as it heats up. It will increase in saltiness because there's less water. It will Also, during the night, if it has to go through the night like that, the algae can't photosynthesize during the night because there's no sun. And so there's less oxygen being made. So basically these little tiny pools have to deal with the salt, temperature, pH changes all throughout the day and night. But then as soon as a wave hits, it all goes back to normal. So in a flash, it has to adjust to the complete opposite conditions. So these are organisms that are very, very strong, well adapted organisms. Here's a video by the Living Coast Discovery Center, San Diego's top tide pooling, that I recommend checking out. So some of the other creatures that you will find in tide pools are like hermit crabs, anemones. I want to point out this crazy one. This is not a fake video. This is a ribbon worm. Ribbon worms are basically able to throw out part of their digestive system and capture their prey using that, and then they'll pull the whole thing inside and eat it. I'm so glad humans don't eat like that. Okay, so there are different resident species that live in tide pools all the time. A lot of them have elongated bodies. They don't have scales often because they really, scales are kind of a liability in this situation for getting caught on things. A lot of the times they are small and dense and really able to hide in those rocks. They are very tolerant creatures. The tidal, there's some that are tidal visitors that just move in and out with the tide, but there's also some seasonal ones that just come in for breeding. And then of course there's the accidental organisms that just got blown in there by a big wave or storm, and they're just stuck there for the day till they can get out, or they maybe die. So this is a video from deep marine scenes called Fax the Blenny. This is a very commonly found fish in tide pools. And this, I just wanted to put a picture here. This is a starburst anemone that is very commonly found in Southern California. So the ecology of rocky shores, the ecology has to do with like the competition and the grazing and the predation and what gets eaten and who the top predators are. So in tropical systems, there tends to be no keystone predator because there's just not that much that is there. There's Also, there can be grazing by different mollusks that will reduce the algae and allow like different barnacles to come in and colonize a space. So here's a video from Deep Marine Scenes Facts, a sea hare. The sea hares are very commonly found in tide pools and cool to know about. And also a Deep Marine Scenes Facts, the California mussel, that talks about the mussels that you find there. So here, going along with the ecology and the food webs, is a food web here, and it shows what the primary producers are, the primary consumers, and then you'll have the secondary consumers and the tertiary consumers. And I made a note down here of examples of each of those in this picture, but I want to recognize that the main source of energy comes from our sun for all of this to exist. So there is variation in there's variation in what is able to grow based on water flow. So where there is a lot of water flow, you'll actually have very neatly organized species of animals in different spaces. Where you have less water flow, everything tends to get messy, and larval bodies of new babies of any of these just kind of hold on and grab wherever they can. But when there's lots of water flow, it tends to organize itself a little bit better. So there are some positive interactions between species. Some groups will come together to buffer and hold water better, to like slowly release water from their shells for evaporative cooling, to avoid desiccation, to also help with mating. It also helps to be in groups because if they're attacked by a predator, perhaps some of them will survive in the group. This is a really, really cool shark called the epaulet shark. And the epaulet shark has actually evolved a way to move in between tide pools by climbing out of the water and getting what it needs to. It's a really cool shark, and I recommend watching that from Deep Marine Scenes. Another one from Deep Marine Scenes is the facts on chitons, so that you can learn more about the chitons. Okay, so after there has been a disturbance in any ecosystem, there's always something later called succession, where new creatures are able to move in. And I wrote a common succession here, the diatoms or algae, then moving to a red algae, then barnacles, mussels, until we have reached a climax or top level community. Now, every time there's a mass disturbance to an area where it wipes everything out, you can have in the end a different climax community, and that's called a regime change. So you don't necessarily have the same community that you had before. So you can have a different sequence. So these disturbances could be something like a large log comes up and hits a whole space and wipes everything out of that area. You could have, humans could come and bulldoze a certain area, and it's all got to start over in that space. You could have a huge storm that literally churns everything up and moves large rocks around. So that is a major change. So those are all good examples of when disturbances happen, and we always want to minimize human disturbances on oceans. This is actually, there's very little information about succession in the oceans. You're not able to find it as well as you do about land succession happening. But this was an excellent paper that I put the citation here so that you can read it. But basically, it was a study done where Hong Kong actually had done a lot of trawling where they pull nets along the bottom of the ocean. And they had done this trawling, and the trawling had released a lot of sediment in the water that made it really foggy under the water, or turbid it's called, where you couldn't see through the water very well. The sand was very churned up and very homogeneous instead of having good layers. The fish were, no shocker, a lot smaller at this time because they're swimming through turbid conditions. It's hard to breathe through that. So not a shocker, in their sand, they actually had very few total, they didn't have as much species abundance. So after they banned the trawling, they actually not only increased in their diversity, but also their abundance of creatures. Their fish actually grew larger. Their sediment actually settled correctly into layers, and their water was not as turbid. This is a before and an after disturbance, and how the ocean worked to recover. So after you have some kind of disturbance, the diversity can be affected, okay? And it's not just humans, it can be storms, it can be freezing, it can be debris. Of course, that humans want to minimize their impact, but it also happens other ways. But afterwards, when organism starts to come back, it can be very patchy. And diversity, sometimes the biggest top competitors don't come back immediately. So that allows some less successful competitors to come in. So this is a video from Deep Marine Scenes Facts, the Weedy Sea Dragons. It's just another cool thing that you can find up there in the tides. So there are also, besides, we've been talking rocky shores the whole time. There are also sandy shores that we have in different places, and that makes for a totally different ecosystem. So the beach slope is determined by the waves, the sediment size, and something called the swash and backwash, which we'll talk about in a second. Down here, when you see this person's feet in this GIF, you see the water coming up. This is called the swash. So somewhere out here on the beach, the wave broke, and when it breaks, it will actually just send a bunch of water called swash up the beach and get everything wet. But it's not a breaking wave anymore, so it's called swash. As that starts to go back out, and this GIF does not show it going back out, although the front of this video looks like it's going back out. As the wave is going back out, that is called the backwash. So there's a video on this by down here called Swash and Backwash that I recommend. So the amount of swash and backwash that you have really affects things on the beach. So how is this determined? Well, there are dissipative beaches where there's a lot of wave energy that's there, but it's dissipated over a very broad zone and usually a very like light slope in the ground below the water where it's really just the wave just gets spread out. And so it's just that it dissipates the wave strength. And then you might have right next to it, you could have a reflective beach. And this is when there is like heavy wave action that's kind of narrows to a one place. And because of all that energy coming to one place, the waves can really break right on the shore, and you can have some very heavy waves happening there that will really beat up the beach and take a toll on it. So obviously most organisms would prefer a dissipative beach because it's a little bit less harsh there. So you can have fine sand on a beach or you can have coarse sand on the beach. I almost think of like a lot of coarse sand beaches being like what you will find in Hawaii, whereas like in Southern California, a lot of places have fine sand beach. And in fine sand beaches, you will actually have so many critters growing in there. It will hold water really well, and it's really good for those critters to burrow down and to hide and to feed on other critters that are there. Whereas coarse grained sand will drain well, but it dries out quickly and it gets really hot, and it's harder for things to live in that long term. So the things that do live inside the sand, because you'll see some organisms that are just appear to be eating in the sand all day long at the beach, and you don't know what they're eating. Well, they are eating these organisms underneath called the meiofauna. And these guys are the tiny little nematodes like worms and flatworms and sometimes eggs and other things that are hidden tightly between the sand particles. And they are highly affected by the grain size of the sand. If it's a really coarse grained sand, there's maybe like this one, there's maybe more room for critters to hide, but again, it drains faster and it gets hotter. Whereas the fine grained sand like this tends to have more burrowing critters. It can run out of air, but it will hold water a lot better and be a little bit more constant. So you see more living in that fine grained sand. Also, interesting, a lot of the organisms that live there in the sand will have elongated bodies because they need to be able to wiggle down into the sand. A lot of them will tend to protect their brood because there's so many living things in there that they need to protect them. And different things, different factors like seasons, waves, and predators will affect population size. This is an organism that I see very commonly in Southern California called the fiddler crab. And this is a video about them from Planet Doc called Land of Dragons. I recommend watching this. This is such a funny little crab. These crabs will grow a claw, that's the males will, that are about the size of their whole body. And they will make a little hidey hole that is their little home. And their whole goal with making this awesome home is to attract a female that will come down and lay her eggs. So the males will stand outside their homes and they'll kind of fight and flex their huge claws. And the females will very meticulously go down into each hole and come out, and she'll crawl in a bunch of different holes until she becomes satisfied with one and says, okay, this is the one the house that I'm okay with, and I'm gonna have my babies here. And so eventually she'll settle in on one. One way that you can tell that fiddler crabs are there is they will actually eat the fauna in the soil throughout the day, and they will bring it into their mouth and eat the little critters inside, and they kind of excrete or poop out these tiny little balls of sand behind them. So you'll see these tiny little balls of sand all around their homes. You know, you're probably near a crab like the fiddler crab. Okay, so the sandy areas have different zones, and there's three major zones. One is the up high, it dries out, the superlitoral zone. There's not much life there. There's not much life there because it's so hot and it dries out. So there's maybe life above the sand, but not much in the sand. Okay, and then you have the midlittoral zone and the sublittoral zone. So here is a very common creature in Southern California. Tons of people collect them in the swash of the ocean every year, and they are called the Pacific mole crab. And this video is called It's Dig or Die, and it's from Deep Look. I recommend you watch it. But in these what we call sand crabs in Southern California, when you pick them up, you don't think there's much to them, but this is showing you how they filter feed and how they live in the sand. So in the mid-littoral zone, this is truly intertidal. Intertidal meaning it gets wet and it gets dry during the day. You'll find different organisms like echinoderms or snails, or like here's an amphipod. You will find different things like that. You'll also have bivalves, and bivalves well, actually, oftentimes, and there's various ways that they feed, but some of them lift up a siphon. They will hide in the sand and lift up a siphon. So they're safe underneath the sand, and they will lift that siphon up through one of the tubes. They will bring in water and filter out a bunch of nutrients, and then push that remaining water that now they have filtered out of the other end of that tube. It's really cool. What's crazy is even those are hunted, and you can see these holes through these. This isn't somebody taking some kind of drill and making this. This is a snail who has drilled a hole through these different organisms and sucked out the insides for food. It is the thing of nightmares. So there's different organisms in each zone of the sand, and it really just depends on the type of sand and the time of year and the depth that they are on how they will survive. Here's that same graphic but larger, so you can get some sample things that will live at each level. And then the deepest area of the sandy shores. This is the infraratorial zone. This is truly marine. It's underwater in this zone for the large majority of the year. They will have like seagrass. They will have a lot of sediment and soil. Different fish can live in this. And it's more like a constant paced environment here. So this is a video from Shape of Life Mollusks. This actually shows a moon snail, and they're one of the organisms that will drill through another, like here in cockles, it's called moon snail feeds on cockles. It will show the snail catching a bivalve and eating it. And then here, yeah, I highly recommend this one. This is East Coast Divers, Crazy Scallops. This actually shows the bivalve scallops swimming through the water, and you can almost see them even here. But in this video, it's a quick little video clip from the divers of these scallops just swimming meters across the water. And a lot of people think that these bivalve shells, that they never open, or they just sit there like that all day, and they don't really think about the fact that not only do they open to like remove their siphon sometimes, or to filter feed, but they're also moving across the ocean and fully capable of escape and trying to get away. In fact, you'll see some of that in this video here from Shape of Life. So that concludes our video on the intertidal communities. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you get to the tide pools to experience some of this for yourself.